Hi everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a shocking story. What would you do if you discovered your own father secretly hired people to trap you overseas and silently threaten the woman and child you love, just to control your future? If you find this video interesting, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. That night, after his mother fainted and the house finally went quiet, James lay on the thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling. The fan squeaked overhead, pushing hot air in circles, but his mind was too noisy for sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, calm, composed, untouchable. In his head, he could almost hear that cold voice. "You're my son. You don't get to run away from the path I choose for you." He rolled onto his side, grabbed his phone, and opened the old messages from the anonymous number that had tormented him while he was abroad. "Stay where you are. If you come back, things might happen to the people you care about. Don't test your luck." Back then, he tried to convince himself it was a prank. Now, after everything, he knew better. His father's reach was long, and his methods were never simple. This wasn't strict parenting. This was a plan. "If I don't stop him now, he'll never stop," James muttered into the dark. The next morning, he met Hung at a tiny coffee shop hidden in an alley. Old plastic chairs, strong coffee, no one paying attention to them. The perfect place to talk. Hung dropped into the chair opposite him. "You look terrible," he said. "Did you sleep at all? Does closing my eyes and fighting with my demons count?" James replied. Hung exhaled. "I still can't believe you escaped that training program your dad shoved you into. The more I look at it, the more it feels like a very fancy prison. That's why I asked you here," James said, leaning in. "I'm done running. I want to sue him. A real lawsuit. I want the law to judge what he's done to me. To Diep? To Nye?" Hung's expression turned serious. "If you're serious, we need more than anger. We need evidence." James unlocked his phone and pushed it across the table. "I kept those messages from when I was abroad, and I remember the name of the agency that handled my job placement. It felt fake from the beginning. Now I'm sure it was one of his shell companies." Hung opened his laptop and started searching. After a minute, his brows knit together. Found it. On paper, the agency is owned by some random guy. But look here. He turned the screen. The shares run through 2 other companies, then land right back at one of your father's corporations. It's a loop. James's jaw tightened. So it really is him. He used that agency to keep me overseas. On paper, he still keeps his distance, Hung said. That's his style. But this ownership chain is suspicious. If we match it with your contract and payment records from his group, we'll have something. James stared at the screen. "And what about Diep? She told me someone came to see her while I was gone. They never said my dad's name, but they made it clear her life would be easier without me. If we find that guy and get him to talk, then your father has a real problem," Hung finished. "But people like that don't talk unless they're cornered. I don't want Diep dragged deeper into this," James said quietly. "But if she stays silent forever, he wins." Hung sighed. "We might have to ask her some hard questions. For now, step 1, collect everything we can. Messages, emails, contracts, travel records, money flows. Step 2. Talk to someone who's used to going up against people like your father. Do you know anyone? James asked. There's one, Hung said. Mr. Kwan, old school, rumored to have turned down big bribes. If anyone's crazy enough to take your case, it's him. Then set up a meeting, James said. The sooner, the better. While James was planning his move, Diep was pacing slowly in her tiny kitchen, staring at the new gas tank that had been installed not long ago. She crouched and checked the valve again. The flame was steady. Nothing looked wrong. The installer had been polite and quick. He'd said, "Mrs. Huyen sent me." At the time, she'd just been grateful. But now, after the business partner had suddenly come to withdraw capital, and after hearing Aunt Huyen say that strange sentence, "James will be safe when I get home," her thoughts refused to settle. "Why would Aunt suddenly care about my gas tank?" Diep whispered. "Why now?" Her phone buzzed on the counter. Still no news from James? A text read. The number wasn't saved. Diep frowned and typed back, "Who is this?" No reply. She stared at the screen, unease twisting in her chest, then locked the phone. Lately it felt like someone else was arranging pieces of her life from behind a curtain. "Mom?" Nai peeked in from the living room. "Why are you looking at the stove like that?" Diep forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Go play. Mom's just thinking." Thinking, and starting to fear that whatever James was trapped in had never really ended. It had just changed shape. 2 days later, Hung texted. He agreed to see us. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. The law office was on the second floor of an old building. The sign simple, the hallway quiet. Inside, shelves of files lined the walls. Mr. Kwan sat behind a plain desk, hair more gray than black, reading glasses low on his nose. He studied James for a moment before speaking. "So," he said, "you want to sue your own father? Actually sue him?" "Yes," James replied. "Your father is rich, powerful, and careful," Kwan said. "Men like him don't leave easy trails. Why do you think you can win?" "Because this time, I'm not alone," James answered. "And I'm not backing down." Hung opened his laptop and laid out what they had so far. The fake agency, the shareholder chain, the threatening messages, the suspicious transfers before James was sent away. Kwan listened, asking only for dates and names. When they finished, he tapped his pen on the desk. "This isn't enough to win," he said bluntly. "But it's enough to make him nervous, and when powerful men are nervous, they make mistakes. That's when we move." A small spark lit in James's chest. "So you'll take the case?" Kwan held his gaze. "If I say yes, your life will get harder before it gets better. Your father will fight back. Are you ready for that?" James thought of his mother collapsing on the floor, of Diep's worried face, of Nai calling him Dad in her small voice. Then he thought of his father's cold control over all of them. "I'm ready," he said. Kwan nodded once. "Then, from today, every step you take is either evidence or a trap. Walk carefully, and we start now." From that day on, everything James did felt like it had weight. Kwan gave clear instructions. You don't confront your father directly. You don't send angry messages. You don't announce anything online. You stay quiet and you gather proof. Let him think you're just a stubborn kid throwing a small tantrum. James nodded. "What about Diep?" Kwan looked at him carefully. "If your father really threatened her before, he could do it again. She needs to Be warned, but not scared. And you need to be smart. Don't tell her about the lawsuit yet. Just tell her to be careful around strangers. Jame swallowed. She's already in danger because of me. I can't pretend everything's normal. Normal or not, Quan replied. If you rush, you lose. Trust the process. After meeting Quan, James stopped acting like a runaway and started acting like someone preparing for a real fight. He backed up every threatening message, scanned his overseas contracts, saved flight tickets and emails, then copied everything onto multiple drives. One stayed with him, one with Hung, another in a place only his mother knew. If his father tried to erase the past, something would survive. Quan's warning kept echoing in his head. He won't sit still. Expect him to move first. That move came fast. One evening, James opened the door to his tiny room and froze. A man in an expensive suit was sitting calmly in his only chair, as if the place belonged to him. You're not very hard to find, the man said, smiling. Good evening, young master. James's thumb pressed the side of his phone in his pocket, quietly starting the recorder. Who are you? The man stood, smoothing his jacket. I work for your father. You can call me Kang. The name hit James like a punch. He could almost see Diep opening her door to the same face, frightened and alone. You broke into my room, James said. Don't be dramatic, Kang replied, glancing around at the peeling walls. Your lock isn't exactly high security. I just wanted a private talk. I don't talk to my father's lackeys, James shot back. Kang chuckled. You sound just like him when he's annoyed. Anyway, I'm here with an offer. Your father knows about your meetings with lawyers and your little investigation. He's disappointed, but he doesn't want this to become a public mess. James said nothing. If you stop all this, Kang continued, drop the idea of suing and cut off certain distractions. He's willing to forgive you. You'll get a high position in his company, a big salary, a safe and comfortable future. You're his only son. Eventually, everything will be yours. By distractions, James said coldly. You mean Diep and Nai. They complicate your life, Kang answered smoothly. You were born to run an empire, not to rot in a rental with a woman and a child. They will only hold you back. James's jaw tightened, but his tone stayed calm. When I was abroad, someone sent threats. Someone came to see Diep, told her something bad might happen if I came back. Was that you? Kang paused, then smiled like it was a harmless joke. Big decisions need reminders. We simply helped her see that letting you go was best for you. Sometimes love means stepping aside. So you went to her? James pushed. Because my father told you to. Of course, Kang said casually. He arranged everything. The overseas job, the contracts, the men who watched her house. Those people move only when he gives the order. They fear him more than the law. That was the line James needed. How much did he pay to keep me trapped in that program? He asked. A lot, Kang replied. He invested heavily to keep you away from bad influences and shape you into someone worthy of his name. Everything he did for you. Something twisted in James's chest, but he kept his face blank. Then give him this message, James said quietly. I'm not taking his job. I'm not taking his money. And I'm not stopping. Kang's smile faded. Think carefully. Your father is not a man you want as an enemy. I already chose, James replied, opening the door. We're past that point. King studied him for a second, then smirked. You'll regret this, he said, and walked out. As soon as the door closed, James grabbed his phone and stopped the recording. On playback, Kong's voice was clear. The threats, the surveillance, and the admission that his father had arranged it all. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was evidence. The next day, in Kwan's office, the phone lay on the desk between them. Kwan listened to the recording from beginning to end without interrupting. He replayed the part about the overseas job, the contracts, the men who watched her, then finally leaned back. This is strong, he said. It ties what happened to you and to Diep directly to your father through his employee. It doesn't guarantee a win, but it gives us real leverage, enough to file a serious case. So we can sue him, James said. We can, Kwan replied. False imprisonment, coercion, intimidation. But before we move, there's something you must do. Talk to Diep, James answered quietly. Kwan nodded. She was threatened because of you. That makes her both a victim and a key witness. If she hears all this from court papers instead of from you, it'll destroy her trust. Your father will use that against you. James knew he was right. Trying to protect her with silence had only left her scared and alone. I'll tell her tonight, he said. That evening, he stood outside Diep's door, heart pounding. Warm light leaked out from the window. Inside, he heard Nai talking to her toys. He raised his hand to knock, but the door opened first. Diep stood there, surprised, fingers still on the knob. James, she whispered. Hi, he said softly. Can we talk? Dad! Nai shouted when she saw him. She ran over and threw her arms around his legs. He bent down and hugged her tightly. Hey, princess, did you miss me? A lot, she said, clinging to him. Diep stepped aside. Come in. They sat at the small table while Nee played on the floor. The house looked the same as always, but the air between them felt much heavier. Why did you disappear? Diep asked, eyes fixed on his. People came asking for money, and Huyen acted strange. I got weird messages. I didn't know if you were in danger or if you'd chosen to leave us. I never chose to leave you, James said. But you were in danger, and you deserved the truth. He told her everything. The fake agency, the contracts tied to his father's companies, how he escaped, the decision to sue, Kwan's help, and finally, Kong's visit and the recording. Diep's hands trembled. So I wasn't imagining it, she whispered. That man who came here, he really worked for your father. Calm, polite, middle-aged? James asked. Talked about your future and Nai's safety? She nodded. He said, if I truly loved you, I should let you go. That being with you would ruin your future. I was terrified. That was Kong, James said. He admitted he followed my father's orders. We're going to use his words in court. Diep stared at him, torn between fear and anger. If you do this, your father will see you as his enemy. I know, James replied. But if I stay quiet, he'll control us forever. I want Nai to grow up without being afraid of her own grandfather's shadow. She took a slow breath. What do you want from me? Your choice, he said. Kwan might ask you to testify. I can't promise it'll be easy. I just wanted you to hear everything from me first. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice was steady. I'm tired of being scared, she said. Hey, if he already came after us, hiding won't help. If you're going to fight him, I'll stand with you. Nye climbed into his lap. Dad, are you staying? James looked at Diep. She gave a small, fragile smile. I don't know what's coming, she said quietly. But at least now, we're facing it together. Somewhere across the city, in a high office, James's father closed a report about his son's meetings, evidence, and planned lawsuit. So, he murmured, eyes cold, you really chose to stand against me. The sophisticated plan he'd built to control his son was starting to crack. Whether James could truly break free and win in court was still uncertain. But the battle between father and son had officially begun.
Jame chuẩn bị cho một cuộc chiến pháp lý chống lại người cha quyền lực của mình sau khi gặp luật sư Quân. Anh ta sau luôn các tin nhắn đe dọa, hợp đồng và hồ sơ du lịch để bảo vệ bằng chứng. Ngay sau đó, cánh tay phải của cha anh, Khang, xuất hiện trong phòng anh với một thỏa thuận hủy bỏ vụ kiện, rời khỏi Diệp và Nhi và trở về đế chế gia đình. Trong cuộc trò chuyện căng thẳng của họ, Khang thừa nhận chương trình ở nước ngoài và các mối đe dọa đối với Diệp đều do cha của Jame sắp đặt. Jame bí mật ghi lại mọi thứ, đưa cho Quân bằng chứng quan trọng về sự ép buộc và đe dọa. Quân đồng ý tiến về phía trước nhưng khăng khăng rằng Jame trước tiên phải thành vật với Diệp. Sau đó, Jame đến thăm cô, tiết lộ toàn bộ âm mưu và xác nhận người đàn ông khiến cô sợ hãi là nhân viên của cha anh. Bất chấp nỗi sợ hãi của cô, Diệp quyết định đứng về phía Jame khi cuộc chiến giữa hai cha con thực sự bắt đầu.